is Professor McCarthy from York University. Zack McCarthy, I apologize, is a PhD candidate in applied mathematics and a member of the Laboratory of Industrial and Applied Mathematics, LIAM, both at York University. He's also a member of the Mathematical Modeling COVID-19 Task Force. His work is focused on the modeling of respiratory diseases, primarily utilizing transmission dynamic models. And the presentation is a retrospective and proactive assessment of the COVID-19 epidemic in Ontario, Canada. Insights from transmission modeling analyses. Thank you very much, Zack.
Great, thank you very much. So first, I'd really like to thank CIHR for the support, as well as for the organizing all of the work that goes behind the scenes, as well as the task force, as well as the invitation to speak here today. And also, I'm speaking, but I acknowledge teamwork from a team spanning York and also beyond to provide modeling analyses over the past 2+ years now in Ontario and in Canada. This includes our LIAM COVID-19 Reopening and Recovery Modeling Group, as well as collaborators Professor Murthy and Dr. Ogden from PHAC. To set the stage here first with context, our work is primarily focused in Ontario, and that's been the really the primary geographic region of our team's work. And the figure shown here, this is the confirmed cases of COVID-19 by date of report. So you will see an increasing trend in the recent few weeks. And you'll also see here each distinct wave of cases. And what I'll go through now is a narrative, some of our established works, so select works, and really starting at the beginning to give the story behind it. And we'll look at both retrospective elements as well as proactive elements. So first, and I will be very brief to just give the flavor. But first, this was analysis that was completed in mid-April, around the peak of the time of the peak of the first wave and published later. So this article accomplished two key things for us. One was fitting of the transmission dynamics model. So the flow diagram for this model is shown here on the bottom left, with control interventions to the surveillance data in Ontario. This process formed the foundation for many of our subsequent analyses. And to expand a bit on this, the fitting yields a model-based estimation of the mitigation measure efficacy. For example, we looked at the really three control interventions in terms of distancing, so physical distancing or reduction of contacts, testing, diagnosis, and isolation, as well as contact tracing. So these measures were incorporated in the mechanistic model as distinct and adjustable model parameters, and we exploit this throughout our analyses. And in the interest of time, on the bottom right here, I would just like to mention that we show the potential reductions in the peak number of cases and infections that could be achieved with increasing personal protective measures, increasing the fraction of individuals that are traced and isolated before entering their infectious period, and also increasing the proportion of individuals that are detected. In other words, diagnosed and isolated. And on the third column here, we show the isochlines of the reproduction number as a function of each control parameter. So this technique is useful to see the necessary conditions on measures to avoid a rebound in cases or to maintain control. So this subsequent paper published in Biology was written on April 30th. This was about 2 weeks after the peak in cases in Ontario of the first wave. And we looked at the feasibility of reversing the measures that were implemented and the necessary conditions, really quantifying the necessary conditions in order to avoid the rebound. And we showed that this was possible to ease some of the physical distancing measures, and this was the case, and we did avoid that second wave. This was postponed until the fall. Now on the bottom right is again, the isochines of the reproduction number with quarantine fraction here on the horizontal, and the fraction of symptomatic individuals diagnosed and isolated before entering their, actually diagnosed and isolated on the vertical here. So this demonstrates really an important feature that control measures can act in a cooperative manner to reduce the reproduction number. And we show these for contact rates that we estimated on March 24th, which was the non-essential workplace closure, as well as 3 other scenarios of reduction by 25%, 50%, and 75% to look at conditions on controllability. So we'll move on to the age stratified analysis. So using an analog, so an age stratified analog of the model used in the previous 2 works, we looked at a retrospective assessment of the first wave. So what this methodology allowed us to do was to assess the age stratified contact mixing pattern. So in different settings, in the household, the workplace, the community, and the school setting, and therefore an estimation of the infection acquired in each of these settings. So on the top right of your screen here, you'll see the contact matrices in each phase of physical distancing in the first wave. And logically, the household mixing pattern emerges as the measures become more stringent. And also a numerical depiction of these contact matrices on the bottom right. So we'll see that the total contacts, the jargon here is the mean connectivity. That's the average number of contacts per person in the population each day. So this was initially the pre-pandemic levels over 12 per day to at the end of, well, on May 16th, was estimated to be about 6.5. So a substantial drop, and this was enough to drive the control reproduction number below 1. And we also identify a shift from community-acquired infection to household-acquired infection after the interventions. So we'll see the community is the initial dominant prior to the measures, followed by the household is the primary contributor to infection. And also importantly, we estimated the susceptibility to SARS-CoV-2 with respect to age. So there is an age gradient. And at the time of this work, which was early 2020, we provided one of the first estimates of this susceptibility gradient. So this was one of few points of evidence. We also looked at how to avoid the B117 wave, now known as alpha. So what we did, we had estimates of the relative transmissibility of alpha compared to the ancestral strain. So we looked at requirements in terms of the control number. And actually, I'm sorry, so in terms of control measures and the activity levels in the population that was needed to drive that reproduction number to less than the threshold 1. So again, we show our contour plots. And as an example, if we turn to the estimated stage 2, the contact rate in stage 2 of our Ontario reopening about 6 contacts per day, then we need a quarantine fraction of about 60%, as well as a fraction of diagnosed individuals of about 65%. That is individuals who escape contact tracing and go on to develop symptoms, tested, diagnosed, and isolated. Okay, so that's the detection fraction. And the point of this was that these levels of control were far higher than what we estimated, and that allowed for a narrow window of opportunity to prevent the alpha wave in Ontario. And that's the story behind the title. There was a narrow window while case counts were low to achieve control with strict tracing and detection. And it's true that some jurisdictions could be achieving these high levels of testing and isolation today. And in the interest of time, I'll be very brief with these last few. So we also developed, our team also developed and used a stochastic optimization technology based on an analog of the transmission dynamics model described earlier. So we determine optimal pathways from lockdown to reopening. And this was done in 2 seasons in 2020 and 2021 to maximize the social and economical activities while not overwhelming the healthcare capacity. So we use the ICU as a proxy. That was the key target for us. And we minimize that intensity of social contact lost. And just to show on this figure here, panel A is the time evolution of the activity levels that were identified by the stochastic optimization from stringent measures, contact rate slightly above 4, to nearly pre-pandemic levels about 10. And what the analysis shows is that if we turn to the ICU, there is a small rise in number of individuals in the ICU due to COVID-19, but this subsides due to depletion of susceptibles. So this is smart reopening. And lastly, we assess the age stratified attack ratios as a function of different adjustable model parameters, which were social contact mixing and the mean duration of infectivity. And this mean duration, we used as a proxy for testing and tracing measures, right? So the overall key of this work is that we show the critical dependence of the attack ratio among children, the children to children contact rate. So I'm looking at the bottom left table here. The dependence of this attack ratio on these contact rates and the days prior to isolation. So one example I'd like to point out is that when children contact levels are high and the infectious duration is 6 days, we avoid an outbreak in the children. But on the other hand, the attack ratio goes up to 20% in this age class because they were not vaccinated at the time, if the infectious period is increased to 7 days. So that's the critical dependence. And on the right, we see a visual depiction of these attack ratio dependence on, so the left-hand column here is the children contact rate, and on the right here is the mean duration of infectivity. And the 3 areas, or 3 priority areas that we're working on now are forecasting and nearcasting model architecture development. So we're developing multiple nearcasting platforms. Our COVID-19 dashboard is live online, as well as transmission dynamics models for forecasting and scenario analyses. There's been contributions from our team to the Ontario Modeling Consensus Table. So our PI, Professor Jianhong Wu, is a member of the table. And also item number 2 here is extending the work presented in Royal Society on the previous slide to assess the age stratified hospitalization and ICU attack rates, and this dependence on the key parameters at play to set up a scenario analysis. And briefly, we're also working on the impacts of co-circulation of multiple respiratory pathogens. And in particular, we're concerned about influenza, which could be a real challenge if it begins circulating at the normal levels, given added stress on the healthcare system in respiratory illness season from COVID-19. In conclusion, so modelers and modeling have been used in the past 2 years to help inform the response in terms of decision and policymaking to COVID-19 locally and also globally. So I have here shown a select few works established and in progress. And just to make 2 brief points, in most future scenarios that are predicted, COVID-19 will pose threats to our population, and there will be in the foreseeable future questions of how to best manage it, as well as to provide the risk assessment. So this is reminiscent of influenza, which poses burden, and quantitative tools are used for its management regularly. It just happens to be slightly below the public radar, perhaps. So therefore, it seems to me that it's important to advance and to expand the modeling technology to improve that ability to manage COVID-19. And as a second sort of concluding remark, the technology developed in the modeling tools and partnerships can be used for other emerging respiratory pathogens, adding to the EID preparedness. This is an important point. So much of the work that was done for other, so you may think of SARS or pandemic influenza or MERS, these were used, the body of knowledge used here was used extensively in the response to COVID-19. So I will stop here and just lastly thank everyone involved.
Okay, thank you very much, Zack, for that very interesting presentation.